Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to our first session after lunch today. In case anyone's in the wrong spot, this is the Migrants and Refugees session. For those of you who don't know me, my name's Dr. Kate Bagnall. I'm Senior Lecturer in Humanities at the University of Tasmania. And my own research is in Chinese Australian history, so it's a real pleasure for me this afternoon to chair this session on migrants and refugees. So we have 3 papers this afternoon, and we'll be running in the order that's in the program. And each of the speakers will speak for about 20 minutes and 10 minutes for questions after each of the papers. So it gives me great pleasure to welcome our first speakers, Yin Ko and Christopher Cheng. So Yin is a new migrant to Australia from a Cantonese speaking background, and Chris is a second generation Chinese Australian, also from a Cantonese speaking family background. And they're going to be talking to us about oral histories with Cantonese immigrants in Australia. So, welcome.
Coming from Hong Kong, a part of southern China, I spoke Cantonese, but knowing Cantonese would not be enough in Australia. So in 2019, when I arrived in Sydney, I was worried about communicating. Many immigrants like me also bring with them a linguistic baggage that impacts their everyday lives abroad. For example, my partner Christopher Cheng told me that when he was visiting Boîte, an ancestral home of Sydney Chinese in Guangdong, a villager had told him that when fellow villagers in Sydney shop, they have no choice but to point to this and that, and when it comes to payments, they give cash, not always knowing how much it costs until after they get the change. Clearly, not speaking any English, or as Alice Kong, the award-winning Australian author of Unpolished Gem, puts it, speed 打印嘅歷書為累骨, influence the way people live in a new country. One narrator shared during an oral history interview that understanding Australian humour was a challenge to him. We don't understand jokes because of our limited English, because we didn't know slang. You don't know when to laugh. Not understanding makes it harder to attend social gatherings, and of course, make local friends. So in addition to language difficulties, newcomers were lonelier. From personal experience, I felt this due to my partner Chris' seemingly never-ending PhD studies. Not to mention the on and off lockdowns that would occur during COVID, on top of the worries about the political unrest in Hong Kong. All these troubling events happened in my first 2 years in Australia. It was also during the time Chris and I began an oral history project with the State Library of New South Wales. It is worth saying that before this project, interviews in Australia were mainly conducted with those narrators who articulate in English, even those with Chinese Australians. However, these mutual language barriers between the interviewers and potential immigrant narrators have narrowed the spectrum of narrators to those articulating in English. Usually, this would include the second generations and beyond, or at least those who had had the benefits of English medium education and were thus better assimilated. The problem here is that the first generation perspective are seldomly recorded, and as a result, non-English speakers were generally excluded in the making of Australian history, even when many of them are the pioneers. So our project mainly focused on the first generation Cantonese speakers in New South Wales. The value of preserving Cantonese voice in Australia is also significant, because this migrant group has a long history, and because oral history in a community language like Cantonese are also rarely done, often due to its complexity, as Sophia Koshman found. Still, Cantonese remain one of Australia's longest migrant groups, and many originating from the gold rush era. In contemporary Australia, Cantonese has been marginalized, with the rise of Mandarin Chinese speakers. But oral history in Cantonese can still be the way of promoting cultural and linguistic diversity, to record voice, memories, and perspectives of linguistically diverse groups in Australia. In a 2021 article, What If I Speak Another Language?, the author noted that culturally and linguistically diverse communities have distinctive priorities and needs. In this presentation, we will discuss how the role of home cultures, including language, influence the lives of Australians whose native language is not English. We pay special attention to culture because it is hidden, but also fundamental to understanding migrant life. Another consideration was that, given the time and resources required, we selectively interviewed people who could provide a unique perspective on the Chinese-Australian way of life in New South Wales. So far, we have focused on different occupations and unique roles performed by Cantonese-speaking Australians, including in the sphere of community, education, health, spiritual, elderly, and afterlife care. Today, we will start by talking about culturally specific preference and practice that emerging from the 8 narrators. We will then discuss how it relates to careers. The paper ultimately demonstrates the values of doing interviews in the narrator's own language and discuss the potential of multilingual future for oral history in Australia.
As we are interested in understanding the lives of Australians whose first language is not English, we have cited translated oral history transcripts. In many cases, first-generation Cantonese-speaking migrants often reflect on the continuities and differences between their lives in Australia and their places of origin. And in doing so, they also reveal deep-seated cultural beliefs and values. Let us look at the specifics in Sydney. We all know that Chinese place excessive emphasis on educational achievement of their children. But why? Mr. Lin Ho, the founder of the Tutorial Centre in Parramatta, cited both practical and traditional reasons in an interview. Many first-generation migrants probably worked in a restaurant. Of course, it is a different picture now. Some are professionals. Still, English is not their first language, and there may be lots of setbacks. So they put a lot of energy and expectations onto the next generation. Plus, traditionally in China, the status of the scholar official was usually an unfulfilled aspiration of many. Given these reasons, it is no surprise that, as a second-generation Chinese Australian, I recall being pestered by my mother to do more homework, while other kids could negotiate how they spent their free time. The Australian kids played all day and all night. They can argue with their parents. I want to go out. I want to go to my friend's house. I couldn't. I would be beaten if I insisted. Here we can see how parental authority played out in a single mother household where Cantonese was the only language spoken. While after-school tutorial centres helped many parents achieve their educational goals, there are, of course, downsides. For instance, because they are pushed in one direction, these children seldom play sports, noted the educator we interviewed. The issue of missing out on mainstream sports also reflects a cultural preference. In another interview, a Hong Kong migrant parent mentioned that most Hong Kongers were not familiar with the major sports played in Australia. Cecil Law said, "The major sport in my early days are the same as those now: rugby, Australian football, golf and tennis. You can always watch these being played on TV. Besides, I had never played them, nor did I know their rules. The important thing to keep in mind here is how parents' understanding of sports can actually hinder their child's involvement. Therefore, children born of Chinese ancestry may be negatively affected by their heritage. I would like to move on to discuss how cultural ideals play a role in elderly care. During an interview with the CEO of a Chinese nursing home organization, Ada Chen indicated what it meant to provide culturally appropriate aged care. Our meals should be Chinese, that is, rice dishes, not Western meals. In the past, diet was a major consideration for elders choosing to live in a Chinese nursing home. You can imagine, they feel uncomfortable being served a cup of cold milk or mashed potatoes. We also prepare long-life noodles to celebrate their birthdays. In addition to dietary considerations, activities for Chinese elders include mahjong, for leisure, not gambling, and observations of major Chinese festivals. I'd like to now discuss how Chinese families view burials. Selina Leung, a funeral director Kiko interviewed in Sydney, told us that I have been in the industry for 20 years and I feel like, wow, everything is so expensive. But when you talk to immigrants from Asia, they think it's so cheap, it's so damn cheap to buy a burial plot here. Besides, it may not be possible now to be buried in their ancestral homeland, Selina said. Most would choose to be buried here in Australia if they can, because land is so scarce. It's so hard to find a burial plot in Asia. While there may be no place to be buried in the homeland, at Rookwood, there is a preference among the Cantonese in Sydney to be buried close together. King Fong stated, the Chinese, Koiwa, Chanyi Lawa, the living and the dead, enjoy the crowds. We have shown that, however bizarre everyday choices may seem at first, they show how immigrants are influenced by both pragmatics and tradition. Scholars have noted that migration provides a double frame reference, comparing their place of origin and destination. This dual perspective constitutes everyday life choices and shapes the opportunities to migrants, including job choices.
Now, I would like to move on to discuss how cultural values have created unique career opportunities for migrants, some of whom become pioneers or even leaders in their vocation. Ada, the CEO of Chinese nursing home organization, recounted that her career began as a social worker in Hong Kong. After moving to Australia in 1989, she has been promoting cross-cultural awareness. Because of her long engagement with the government, Ada was later persuaded to take on a leadership role. She tells how she was recruited. Ada, we are already old. You will get old one day too. You will get old one day too. Why don't you consider that your experience in the government can also benefit the Chinese community? Since taking on the job, Ada has encouraged her colleagues to view their job as a double blessing. This is because of the traditional respect that the Chinese have for the elders, Ada said. Hence, here we find that respect for the elderly not only influenced Ada's decision to take on the job, but once at the nursing home, she continues to nurture the cultural value at her workplace. I would now like to discuss another industry. Most of us know that the Chinese avoid the topic of death. So why would somebody join the funeral industry? Sydney's first and only Chinese female director, Selina Leung, mentioned to me that most people think doing female work is disgusting, and they won't dare to do it. In our interview, she recalled her working life that she had visited nursing homes as an insurance broker, only to get the door slammed in her face. The point was that life insurance hinted at death. But after working in the customer service industry in both Hong Kong and Australia, her thick face and extensive connections would eventually help her transition. One day, a friend said that a female company have been looking for a Chinese woman for over a decade without success. Selina jumped at the chance and later started her own company 10 years later. As a business owner, she has found the avoidance of death is still hard to convince. Young people have turned down her job offer, saying, "I don't know how to get along with my family if I get into this industry. My aunties may hesitate to invite me to their birthday parties. I may feel hesitant to attend my friends' weddings. The worst thing is that I don't know what to do when I meet somebody in Chinatown during Chinese New Year." Here we find deep-seated cultural values, like the awkwardness of talking about death, continue to shape the vocation of young Chinese Australians.
Throughout this project, we found that speaking in a person's native language, we can more easily reach a deeper level of understanding. Conversely, for some, speaking in English may inhibit communication. This became apparent when the interviewee said she had become lonelier after her father-in-law, the only Cantonese speaker in her extended family, passed away. Her third-generation Chinese-Australian husband, like those who grew up under white Australia in South Flow's The Pearl, has already forgotten his ancestral language and culture. But in an era of multicultural Australia, a time when speaking another language was more widely accepted, alternative worldviews began to transcend the everyday life experience in Australia and recount a bigger picture, not just the working life in Australia, but the continuation of life practices from their birthplace or homeland to their settlement in Australia. In the year the dragon came, for example, new arrivals, like Kiko, felt dislocated, not yet grounded in Australia, but far from their home country. In the long term, however, as shown in our oral history project with the New South Wales State Library, speaking in their mother tongue, Cantonese, allows us to clearly see how culture, indeed, shapes the everyday lives of long-term immigrants in multicultural Australia. What they eat, how they want to be buried, how their children grow up, and what jobs they get. In fact, interviewing in their own language, we have been told many professional people's ups and downs, twists and turns, which may not necessarily come through if we had spoken in our second or third language, English.
In this talk, we argued that oral history in community language provides migrants whose English may not be their first or best language to have their story told. And looking at the career of some Cantonese speakers who have been able to capitalize on their cultural background, we can see another image of the Chinese Australian emerge, which is not the stereotypically helpless or the dumb person, or a Chinese man in a restaurant, market gardens, or grocery store. By making room for native speakers of Cantonese to become narrators, we can see diversity, and more than that, the long process of reclaiming an aspect of multicultural Australian history has begun. Oral history in a community language gives confidence to narrator, telling them that their stories are worth telling, and that as fellow Australians, they matter. This initiative also gives confidence to potential Cantonese speakers who, like the narrator speakers, may not be so confident in English, letting them know that there is another Australian story that is not told in English. Besides, without oral history with first-generation immigrant Australians, in language other than English, it would be much harder for future generations to understand how their ancestors become pioneers in a new country. For me personally, practicing oral history also helped me adjust to a new life here in Australia and understand from those before me how immigrants eventually making a new home for themselves. Being a newcomer myself, I offer an empathetic ear of understanding to my narrators. The interviews were humble and candid conversations with a younger friend, and the sharing of life experience have helped me during my troubling early years in Australia. Knowing how beneficial these recordings have been for a newcomer, I think the product of this exercise will also be helpful for other future migrants to Australia, especially those from Hong Kong at a time when new immigration is at a new peak. The recording have begun to appear in the catalogue of the State Library of New South Wales, where it will be preserved for the long term. For those who cannot yet understand Cantonese or read traditional Chinese, a translated transcript is available in English with footnotes and transcription symbols to provide necessary context. Finally, we sincerely thank the State Library for their work behind the scenes in facilitating and cataloging the interviews, the Chinese Australian Historical Society for their encouragement, and a huge thank you to all our narrators. We suggest that this community language oral history project provides an example of how other non-English language groups can also work with their local or state libraries to expand their own collections through oral history, and in unison provides a new, multivocal understanding of what it means for non-English speakers to live in a multicultural Australia. Thank you.
Thanks, Chris and Kiko. I can already see one enthusiastic hand.
Thanks so much. That was really interesting. I really see the benefits that you said about interviewing in native language and then getting those, having that shared cultural background. Was there any time though where, say for example, the funeral director, and you were, the cultural beliefs around death and that sort of thing, did anything come up where the interviewee didn't really explain it because you already knew it as the interviewer, so that when I'm listening to it and I don't know about that, was there any instance where you had to say to them, pretend I don't know this, can you explain why death is like such a controversial thing or something? Does that make sense?
Yeah, that is a very good point. For me, as a native speaker, share the same language with the funeral director, I do understand what she means about some cultural taboo or values. So we do mention the explanation about the cultural values in the footnotes. And thanks for the help from Chris. He do the excellent research on how does it mean from Australian perspective, try to make it more understandable to the local Australian.
Thank you for the presentation. I have two questions.
Just maybe wait for the microphone.
Yeah, sorry. I thank you. I have two questions. The first is, are your interviewees all from Hong Kong? Do you have any interviewees from other parts of China who speak Cantonese? And the second question is, what do you think is the biggest insight or difference from this study compared to previous studies looking at Chinese Australians?
Maybe I answer the first one and you come up with the second one. The first one is we do have the narrators who was not born in Hong Kong, like Chris mentioned, that is King Fong, community elders, who was more than 80 years old, who was born in Zhongshan, in Fiji, and his ancestral background was from Zhongshan, the southern China. And also, the founder of the tutorial center, she was born in Macau. So, and small cities near Hong Kong, but also at southern China. And the second question is about.
I think, as we mentioned earlier in our presentation, many of the previous studies were by those who are more familiar and articulate in English. And I think with language and culture, you get a different perception of the world. And I think by talking to someone who is, even if you did the same interview with the same person who spoke English and Cantonese, you'll get a different answer. And so this is a perspective of a Cantonese person. Another perspective is that most likely, if you speak in a language other than, if you interview a person in a language other than English, they have lived overseas, and that is another aspect that they would bring into the interview, and it's a cultural framing. Yeah.
So, unless there's another question. My question kind of follows on from yours actually a little bit, which is about you talked about generational respect, and you're clearly younger than the people that you're interviewing. Do you think that that shapes the nature of the interviews, that your interviewees, like you're being respectful as a younger generation, and they're being the elders sharing the information? Do you think there's things that they wouldn't have told you because you were younger? Sorry.
I think Sophie did mention or highlight upon that in Chinese culture, we do respect the elders. So I can feel that as a younger friend from them, I really feel that they are very sincere and open-minded to share their perspective or even their thinking about how did the Chinese living in Australia in their days. And I do feel that the conversation hasn't been shaped by the age difference so much. And I remember back to the questions the previous participant asked, I did encounter another narrator who was born in Guangzhou, and she was almost 80 years old. I would say she is very liberal and transparent to even share her view living in mainland China in her earlier days. So I think as I'm much younger than them, they do show me as kind of a guidance, because they know that I'm a new migrant. They share their living experience when they were the new migrants, and also the everyday life experience when they has become old migrants for a few decades ago.
Okay. I think we probably have time for one more question if there's any more.
That's excused by lack of knowledge of this. But you were talking about Cantonese.
Just wait 1 second.
Hi, thanks for your talk. I'm Tim from Georges River Libraries, Hurstville. You mentioned this is an ongoing project. I wanted to know how many participants you're aiming to have for your project, and have you encountered any hesitancy from the community to be involved, and how do you deal with that?
We haven't had a set number, but when we first approached the State Library, we did prepare a list of possible professions that might be of interest. At the moment, we've had a few people who've postponed the interview due to COVID, and we did have some people who declined because they weren't comfortable having their voice recorded, and I think that is natural with many oral history projects. King Fong, who we talked to, and he mentioned that people of a lower status generally didn't want to be interviewed, like people like market gardeners or chefs in Chinese restaurants. They felt their life was, they didn't have a story worth telling, which is something that we probably need to work on, or talk to more experienced people and see how we can work around this.
That's an experience we've had at Personal Library with my colleagues who are Chinese Australian, with projects that we've done as well at our library. Yeah.
All right, we just have the one last question.
Oh, sorry, just please excuse my lack of knowledge, but you're talking about Cantonese speakers. Are they mainly Hong Kong or Guangzhou? And sorry, could you just give us a very brief overview of where the geographical differences are between Cantonese and Mandarin?
Kiko is looking for the map. The earlier, for most of Chinese Australian history, for a long part of Chinese Australian history, it has been a Cantonese majority that has resided in Australia. It's only after the 1980s that the migration has expanded to Mandarin speakers. Around Hong Kong, it's Guangdong province, which is the Cantonese, is the centre of Cantonese, and that was the main place where a lot of these migrants came from, and they came through Hong Kong, whether they was originally from Hong Kong or not. And Cantonese was the lingua franca of that region. And now, across China, Mandarin has been the standard language of China. And in Hong Kong, people are learning Cantonese and Mandarin. So you can see that there's a linguistic shift in the demographics.
Is there much crossover between those two dialects, like that? Mandarin and Cantonese? No crossover?
No.
I would say they're different language.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, well, let's thank Kiko Great. Our second speaker this afternoon is Chen Rose, and Chen is a consultant historian, and she's also undertaking a PhD at ACU. And Jen's going to be talking to us about some consultancy work that she did for a community arts organisation.
So I use the computer. Yeah, it's good. I'm glad I got this mic with that rain starting up again. I'd like to begin by paying my respects to the people of the Stony Creek Nation as the traditional owners of the land on which we're meeting today, and pay my respect to elders, past and present, and acknowledge that sovereignty over this land was never ceded. My presentation today will be drawing on both my work as a commissioned professional historian in developing a web-based organisational history for the Boîte, Melbourne's iconic multicultural music organisation, and it's a history through music, song and story, which was developed to mark the 40th anniversary of the organisation in 2019. My work with the Boîte sparked some broader historical questions, which I'm now examining through my PhD research, looking at migrants' rights activism in Melbourne from the 1960s into the 1990s. And so I will also be drawing from some of that research too. Oral history interviews were a central source for the history of the Boîte, A total of 26 interviews were undertaken for the project, and while they provided rich material for this organisational history, they also provided important insights into the context of migrants' rights activism expressed in both grassroots communities and within developments in education, community and ethno-specific services in Melbourne in the 1970s and 1980s, amongst which this newly forming arts organisation found the support to grow. My focus today will be on sharing some of those insights gleaned from the oral history testimony of some of the founding members of the organisation that both serve to illustrate or to further illustrate the social and cultural history of Melbourne at this time, and to remind us of the rich source material that the research undertaken for organisational histories can potentially offer social historians. Specifically, there are insights into the important role of teachers as early advocates for migrants' rights in asserting the educational rights of migrant children and young people, and the cultural rights of students and their families, and in forging new ground in considering and implementing multicultural practice within a service setting. The interviews also reveal the relationship of influence and engagement between the fledgling Melbourne Boîte and the broader battle for cultural rights in the realm of public broadcasting and the fight for migrant workers' rights. Before I go further, I'd like to make a quick note about language. The word migrant is most typically used in the historical accounts from the era I'm referring to here to refer to migrants of non-English speaking background. And I just wanted to recognise the inadequacy of the use of this word in this way in a contemporary context. However, the term migrants' rights and migrant education were broadly utilised by educators, governments and migrants' rights activists themselves to refer specifically to non-English speaking migrants within this context I'm discussing, so I'll be using those terms. I should acknowledge that this history was developed with funding support from the Victorian Multicultural Commission, the Public Records Office of Victoria and Creative Victoria. Now first, a little more about this actual history. Now this is just a screenshot that I've got here, but I'll just quickly click on this link and we'll see if it'll go. If not, that's okay, we can just, no, it won't, okay, that's all right. Now I have to get back to my presentation, which is here. I'm sure, there you go, great. You'll have to check it out in your own time. But the decision to present this history on the web enabled the inclusion of not only excerpts from the oral history interviews, so as to include the voices of founding members, musicians, participants and staff, but also film footage, and most importantly for the Boîte, music. We digitised both the film and audio files from original 1970s tapes to enable them to be seen and heard again for the first time in decades. And so, through the website, you can see firsthand Andean folk band Aparima perform at the very first Melbourne Boîte concert in 1979, or listen to the beautiful performance of the Italian folk ensemble at the Music of Migration concert hosted by the Boîte at the Great Hall of the National Art Gallery the same year. Or you can hear from musicians about their experiences performing in intimate acoustic shows in the Boîte's World Music Cafe, first established in 1989 and still running today, or in their experience leading a 400-voice choir for the Boîte Millennium Chorus concerts that were hosted annually for over 20 years. Both I and the Boîte were delighted when history was awarded the Diversity Award at the Community History Awards of 2020. Oh, hang on, where's my finger? I couldn't find it. Excuse me, techie person. Thank you. Can't find the little thing to move along. Sorry, because I've come to the page. Oh, there you go. Beautiful. What did you push just then? Okay. Well, you can. I'll talk while you figure it out. So, in 1979, the Melbourne Boîte was formed originally as a branch of the Boîte based in Sydney, founded in 1977 by musician and activist Peter Karantinos, along with two friends, Athena Turiki and Tanki Konstantopidos, pictured here in the Sydney Morning Herald newspaper article. Having enjoyed much success in their earliest concerts, they then launched into a program of regular events showcasing artists from various cultural backgrounds with reportedly large audiences of each. Peter is quoted in this article describing the Boîte audiences as mainly of second-generation migrants who had, and I'm quoting Peter here, rejected the monocultural, ethnocentric functions which their parents tried to drag them along to, that they come to the Boîte and they bring their parents with them. Off the back of these successful concerts in Sydney, the Boîte had hoped to expand to Melbourne, and Peter reached out to Melbourne-based friends, George and Cavell Zangelis, to begin this process. And we're going to hear now from Cavell, and you'll also hear her grandchild, who was sitting on her knee while we were doing this interview, reflect on this.
Well, he was really largely instrumental in the Boîte being created in Melbourne. He was a good friend of our family, so that's how the connection. And he was talking about the Boîte in New South Wales, in Sydney, and I was very involved in multicultural education at that stage, and was very attracted, to the idea of having. He was really largely instrumental in.
Sorry, I don't know why it started again. Anyway, as she was saying, she was really connected to education and really keen to embed multiculturalism in that space. So, as she's just mentioned, she was an educator, and she would be one of a number of people who would provide early support for the Boîte to develop in Melbourne, who were educators in secondary, early years and tertiary sectors. Before Peter brought the Boîte to their attention, Cavell and George had been strong advocates for reform in education to support the rights of migrant children and young people to an equitable education experience, and for the education system to respect the cultural rights of migrant families. George was a prominent unionist, active member of the Communist Party of Australia, writer, publisher and pioneer in ethnic and community broadcasting, and he sadly passed away in March 2021. He's pictured here addressing a crowd which, in August of 1974, had marched from Brunswick Girls High School, for those who are not Melburnians, an inner city school with a very high proportion of students of non-English speaking migrant background at that time, into the city, demanding government investment in infrastructure and resources for their school. In their interviews for the Boîte History Project, George reflected on the post-war period and the demands that migrant parents began to place upon the education system to recognise their cultures and the importance of teachers in pushing for change and responding to that call before the education system itself was ready to.
In the 1950s, xenophobia, racism, etc. were running wild. So it was at the time that we began to realize of the changing of our status from migrants into people of minorities, of ethnic minorities, or ethnic communities, whatever you like to call it. Then we wanted to, apart from retaining whatever came with us, but with us in the countries of origin, in terms of culture, of language, and etc., we felt it was important, if it's going to survive, that we need to share it with a broader community. And as you can see, part of our history was an appreciation of the role of the education system played. Anyway, it was in the schools that we tried this, and to the credit of many teachers of different ethnic backgrounds, one of them was my future wife, felt, look, we can't be teaching English as a second language to people unless you know something about their history. So they went through an re-education process, trying to understand the background, the culture, the attitudes, and of course try and find ways and means of teaching about them in schools.
This newspaper article from 1972 features Cavell, at this time a teacher at Collingwood High School, that's another inner city high school, in her capacity as president of the inner suburban group of the Victorian Secondary Teachers Association, the Union for Secondary School Teachers in Victoria. And this inner city group were strong in their calls for reform and investment in education to be more responsive to the needs of migrant students and their families, although at this time the broader union was fairly quiet on this issue. The article reports on a protest meeting at the Collingwood Town Hall in July 1972 that the inner suburban group had organised in the hope that they could mobilise parents of mainly Greek, Italian and Yugoslavian background to participate in some collective action to improve the education offered to their children through the state system. By the time Peter Karantinos had reached out for their support to begin a Melbourne Boîte, Cavell had moved on from Collingwood High to coordinate multicultural programs at the Richmond Community Education Centre, a role in which she was pioneering new approaches to the development of what had evolved from migrant education, essentially still tethered to the aims of assimilationism in its very narrow focus just on the teaching of English as a second language, to multicultural education programs. And here Cavell describes what this newly emerging concept of multicultural education meant to her.
It had to consider sort of rights, the right you have, that should have to maintain, your mother tongue, the right you have to learn English, and then the right to feel comfortable in the total community was, I suppose, the core of it. To have an education experience that was shared by everyone. It had to...
Cavell took on the central role in coordinating the Boîte in Melbourne, with Peter still actively engaged, particularly in sourcing performers at this early stage. As such, the Boîte's first home was at the Richmond Community Education Centre, a kind of hub of multicultural activity at the time. She and George found like-minded people from their networks in education, ethnic broadcasting and other community networks to join them in supporting the Boîte to get off the ground locally in Melbourne. Given the positioning of the Boîte within an educationally focused organisation, it found an early funding source from the Schools Commission, enabling a schools-based program called the Richmond Innovations Project, through which cultural workshops were delivered in school settings. In digitising some of the Boîte's early film reels, we discovered footage of one such workshop. And that's what we've got here. Okay. So, well, you can't see any of this, so I don't need to worry too much about the kids being revealed. Okay. The educational purpose of the Boîte extended to the development of detailed research programs to accompany concerts. Graham Smith, an early Boîte supporter who had been a colleague of Cavell's teaching at Collingwood High School and later became an ethnomusicologist based at Monash University, explained in his interview how the presentation of materials in this way was ultimately a political act, as well as an educational one, as the Boîte sought to advance an expression of multiculturalism in the arts that sought to challenge cultural hegemony rather than simply offer a cultural display.
Certainly at the initial stage, and in an ongoing way, the Boîte saw itself against the sorts of multicultural presentations that I would describe as some sort of fairly shallow spectacle and so on, and wanted to define itself against that. And so the production of fairly rich documentation, along with the presentation, was a way in which it saw itself as being in contrast to such things as the whole sort of shallow folkloric concepts that was seen as being sort of shallow and ultimately apolitical in that sense.
Another experience of migrants' rights activism that influenced founding members of the Boîte lay in the establishment and subsequent closure of 3ZZ Access Radio. When 3ZZ was established in Melbourne as one of two new ABC radio licences granted in 1974, the other being youth station Double J, later Triple J, and they first broadcast in 1975, gave voice to migrants and non-English speaking backgrounds in Melbourne's radio landscape for the first time. The station quickly developed an extensive library of culturally diverse music at the behest of community-based volunteer broadcasters, and culturally diverse musicians found access to a studio and recording opportunities. Richard Brown and Alex Butler, later founding members of the Boîte, had been seconded from the ABC to work to support the establishment of the station, and George Zangelis, who had been a long-standing campaigner for government-funded ethnic broadcasting, was chairman of 3ZZ. When it was announced in 1977 that the Fraser government would be closing the station after such a short time of operating. This sparked significant protest action, which was unable to reverse the government decision and left those who had worked hard in its establishment reeling and acutely aware of the ongoing need for platforms in broadcasting, the arts and politics for the voice and music of people of non-English speaking background. Here, Alex Butler and Richard Brown reflect on the first Boîte concert and its importance to them in the wake of the closure of 3ZZ. Oh no, go back. Excuse me. Hello.
Hopefully, politics is not a matter of only how we box on with the opposition.
Hold on.
Hopefully, politics is not a matter.
Okay, got it now. It's all right. So there it is. Great.
I think emotionally it was probably quite important, don't you think?
Yes.
Like, because, I mean, we've been devastated by WZ being closed down.
Yes.
And we were acutely aware of the sort of silencing effect that it had.
Mm.
And so I guess just to kind of see that something emerging from the ashes, as it were, was very important. Well, to me it was.
Yes, no, I agree. I think that was very important. And it had the sort of, it was partly in a way a celebration, like here we are, we're back. You know?
Yeah, that's right. A bit of defiance.
But there was still that feeling that something had been essentially been lost. And in a way, this first Boîte concert was bringing together, because quite a lot of the people involved with WZ were involved in the concert as well.
Here you can see coverage of the campaign to keep 3ZZ alive, waged by the station volunteers and staff. And first there's a double-page spread that appeared in a Sculptor newspaper, which was produced by staff and students from Brunswick Girls High School, and a flyer appealing for support for the campaign to keep the station alive, framing the closure of the station squarely as a breach of rights. For advocates of migrants' rights of the left, the issue of migrant workers' rights was a central concern, and activism in pursuit of migrants' workers' rights had been taking place for decades really, although it became more coordinated and found new momentum in the early 70s. With the first Migrant Workers' Conference hosted in Melbourne in 1973. George Zangelis, again, had played a central role in the development of this conference and was an active member of the Migrant Workers' Committee for many subsequent years. In 1981, the ACTU hosted the first National Migrant Workers' Conference, again in Melbourne, and the Boîte worked in partnership with them to present a migrant workers' concert, featuring musicians sharing songs about migration and work. This final piece of audio I'd like to share is from George's interview, in which he articulates the importance of music not only to the human experience, but also to political struggles.
Hopefully, politics is not a matter of only how we box on with the opposition, about influence and power and so on. Politics should embrace the totality of life and love and music and all those things that make life worthwhile and beautiful. Folk music, people's music, they're bread and butter. I mean, I remember during the occupation in Greece when we didn't have bread and butter. It was songs that kept us going. And songs about freedom and love and life.
So to conclude, organisational histories, particularly those of organisations that have worked to serve communities, provide really critical insights into our social and cultural history. The stories that stem from them and the source material they hold are often only tapped into when that organisation itself seeks to honour a milestone, and it's often a struggle for them to get the resources to do this. But they can hold significant relevance to broader social and cultural historical inquiry, as I hope my presentation today has illustrated.
Okay, we've got some time for questions. Alex? Yes, I can just search it up.
Thank you. Thanks, Jen. You know I love your work. And congratulations on, I didn't know that the project was in the community history report. That's great. I had maybe a self-indulgent question about the networks between the Melbourne, Boîte and Sydney, and whether or not they, I wrote it down because I don't want to forget, do they develop along separate trajectories politically? And I mean, the migrant rights movement, did it play as pivotal a role in Sydney as it clearly did in Melbourne, probably because of George Nogales? And also that role it had in challenging, as you said, cultural hegemony rather than simply offering cultural display or folkloric multiculturalism. The revival of the Boîte in Sydney that operates now arguably fulfills that function, but I mean, the context is very different. Perhaps they can't fulfill a political function. So.
Yeah, no, well, I'm glad you asked that actually, because it's one of the things that I haven't mentioned here today. But one of the things I found quite interesting about this was that even though the Boîte in Sydney got off to this really great start, and they expanded down to Melbourne, it didn't last much longer at that point in time in Sydney. But it was in Melbourne that it really found a context where it blossomed. And so that's raises questions for me around the fact that it was within the Richmond Community Education Centre, what was going on in that environment in Melbourne at that time that meant that it was able to really take off here, where it had struggled for whatever reason. Clearly there was a need for the gigs. They were getting people turning up to gigs, but they didn't find, my understanding, and I haven't interviewed Peter Carantino, so this is what I've gleaned from what I've sort of read and seen in their archives and stuff. It seemed to me as though they just didn't find the sort of infrastructure and support in the same way that they were able to find here to really make it sustainable. But as you mentioned, they have started a new Boîte. The thing is, the original Boîte has started off with a new life in the last, I don't know how many years, but a few years now.
I mean, it's obviously that club, the class board, that migrant community in Melbourne at that time.
Yeah.
Class, a Greek community in particular.
Yeah.
Melbourne versus Sydney.
I think so. And I think, I sort of hinted at it here, but didn't really go into detail, but Richmond at that point in time, it was genuinely a very strong hub of multicultural activity. And, by 81, by this time, there was something like, there's a Richmond community, directory, and there's something like 23 ethnic organisations in Richmond alone at that point in time. So the kind of social infrastructure that was developing in some of those inner city areas, and particularly Richmond, was really big by the early 80s. So I suppose you can understand this as being within that sort of context. But clearly, as you say, the working class, the link with the migrants workers movement and education and was also part of how it found the momentum to continue on. Yeah.
Although you were doing an oral history, did you go and source any other material? Because I'm aware of George, because of my parents' communist background.
Yes.
And I'm also aware that in the Yugoslav community in Western Australia, ASIO played a very prominent role of closing down constantly Yugoslav newspapers. There's a terrible fear of the left-wing partisans, but of course we know that the only people that actually blew up anything were the Ustasha, which were from the right wing, but they had very close scrutiny on the left-wing community groups and constantly shut down any cultural organisation that they had.
Yeah. George was certainly very closely followed by ASIO, and there's a significant pulse on him. But look, I did. The Boîte themselves had held quite a terrific collection of their own material over time, but I drew on materials from the State Library, from the Public Records Office. So if you look at the website, you'll see evidence of some of this. But since his passing as well, George's papers have been, they are now sitting with Melbourne University, which is terrific because he kept very extensive papers about his work in all of those realms. That they weren't available at the time I was doing this, but they are since available. They're just early in there. They've just been taken on, so they're still to be catalogued properly and stuff. But so yeah, look, there's no shortage of source material in examining this area, and I suppose that's where I've gone on to, particularly in education, I'm finding heaps to work with for my PhD. So. Yeah.
Any other questions?
Jen, I was struck by the quote that you had there from George, where he said, if you're going to teach people English as a second language, then you need to know something of their history. And I wondered if you could reflect on that in light of us as oral historians and, sometimes working with perhaps our own communities that we're familiar with, but, what is it to work with communities that aren't our own, I suppose?
Yes. Oh, look, and I mean, I don't know that my experience of working on, because with Boîte, it was so diverse in terms of the musicians that they were engaging with, and I interviewed people of a very broad cross-section of background, so I didn't necessarily have an experience of coming to know a particular community intimately. But I'm really, I think that what we've heard from our presentation just now, that there is real value, obviously, in opening up a range of interview opportunities and when using people from within a community. But I think for me, what this has really shown, which is slightly different though, is much more about the importance of understanding the political context in which this was taking place. And I'm sort of struck by how little we discuss or place focus on the struggle for migrants' rights and its influence in early multiculturalism, given how important that is to Australia now. We don't sort of really reflect on how did that come to be and what sort of struggles. Well, I think some of us do, but I don't think that we do broadly as a community ask questions about that much. So that was what it really sort of struck for me, was that context of understanding the broader struggles that had taken place by within earlier migrant communities.
Fantastic. Well, in the interest of keeping to time, I think we will put this discussion. So our final two speakers this afternoon are Joan Kelly, who is a museum consultant and sonic artist, and Leonie Lane, who's project manager and graphic designer. And they're going to be talking about migration stories, sound design in place.
Thank you. First of all, we'd like to acknowledge the power of the Tawana lands, especially the Stony Creek people, and also the Bagnall people in Bagnall country who worked alongside our community that we're talking about today, the New Italy settlement in northern New South Wales. Okay. Migration Stories, that's the title of our project, is an exhibition that draws on a key publication, The Power of the Land, in a social history of the Lismore Italians. This publication comprises sensitively edited oral histories recorded by Leslie Jenkins in 1993, originally commissioned by Ellie Garver, an elder in the local Lismore Italian community. The exhibition includes photographs, ephemera, objects, and additional personal memories collected and recorded for an earlier exhibition, Bananas, Business and Boîte, the Lismore Italians, an exhibition by me and the Lismore Italian community at the Lismore Regional Gallery in 2012. These carefully curated elements will anchor a new exhibition housed in the upgraded Italian pavilion at Historic New Italy, also known as New Italy Museum Complex, with the aim of telling the stories of Italian citizens who journeyed from Italy to northern New South Wales, Northern Rivers, in fact, between the 1920s and the 1970s to make a new life for themselves and their families. Okay, who are we? The participants in this exhibition development include Northern Rivers Italian Community Reference Group. I've just listed names of people who've been involved over the years in providing information and photographs, etc., and also feedback as to the direction of this project. They comprise the children and the grandchildren of these early 20th century Italian migrants to Northern Rivers. Working closely with the New Italy Museum Group, we meet monthly at New Italy, planning and adding much valued detail, object donations, feedback, veracity, and tone to developing displays.
I come from a environmental sound background, so I bring a few things from that and from looking in TV for a while as a sound person. So familiar sound ecologies and sonic environments create a strong sense of place for most of us. In fact, we become so familiar with our own sonic spaces, such as our own neighbourhood, that we cease to hear or at least listen in terms of continuing to notice those sounds, the most common elements of that environment. In her 2010 paper, Sound Ecologies, Michelle Duffy speaks to a survey that she did in her local area, which had a lot of bellbirds, and just noted how rarely anyone mentioned that they heard the bellbirds and that they were a key sonic kind of sound in their area. Yeah, so when displaced or transposed in time or space, however, sonic inclusions can instantly recreate transformative experiences for listeners. This is especially true of voice and language. For instance, how do we react when we are overseas and hear an Australian accent? In my own museum practice, creating that intimate, instantly transformative connection with our visitors is a key goal, so I've done a lot of exhibition work as well. While developing the interpretation plan for the redevelopment of the New Italy Italian Pavilion, I read Leslie Jenkins' Power of the Land and listened to a number of the interviews recorded by Leonie Lane, recorded a decade or so later. The Italian Anglo accents come through really strongly in their transcripts, and that immediately, just reading them, immediately took me back to my childhood, which was country Victoria with a lot of market gardeners, Italian market gardeners, and I was instantly there. So I tended to hear the exhibition before I even spoke to Leonie about what that might be.
Okay. So where is this place, New Italy? Well, you can see that we're in northern New South Wales. We're not far from Woodburn and not far from Byron Bay. New Italy, situated in the northern rivers of New South Wales, holds many stories, beginning with the land itself and its traditional owners, the Bagnall clan of the Bagnall Nation, who lived and worked side by side with the developing New Italy community. The New Italy had its beginnings in 1880, when poor farming families from the region of Veneto in northern Italy were beguiled by a Frenchman, the petty noble, the Marquis de Ray, to purchase land in a phantom paradise in the Pacific named La Nouvelle France, an imaginary kingdom east of Papua New Guinea. Instead, after enduring disease and starvation in the festering climate of the tropics, the survivors were eventually brought to Sydney in April 1881 by Sir Henry Parkes, finally coming together to build the New Italy settlement 50 minutes south of Byron Bay. So a long journey and an unusual outcome. The New Italy Museum precinct, commemorated in the 1960s, stands on acreage which was once part of the original New Italy settlement. It includes the New Italy Museum, now it includes the New Italy Museum, which tells the New Italy settlement's pioneering story. It has a Park of Peace, a cafe, a glasswork studio. Across the piazza, the Italian Pavilion was established in the late 1980s after the committee acquired part of the framework and what we term the archways and alcoves, which hold a popular display of Italian regions from World Expo 88 in Brisbane. They are an important element of the New South Wales heritage listing of the pavilion and need to be retained. For decades now, the archways and alcoves have held the beautiful landscape painted by the keen advocate of the pavilion, Floriano Volpato, with interpretation panels outlining each Italian region. Okay. All right, sound placement. All right, let's go back a bit, sorry. The Italian pavilion, exhibition design pavilion plan, and this is a project, a work in progress, so this is where we're up to at the moment, is follows the process of chain migration, and the pavilion exhibition has identified three main paths, and you can see that they've been identified with colours. We've got the migration stories that actually follows through the centre of the building, and then we've got the regional displays and also the community displays depicted in blue. The migration stories tells the story, talks of departures and arrivals through the decades of the 20th century and are depicted from entrance to entrance from the spine of the building. Okay. The Northern Rivers Italian community displays will expand on community themes in the archways, while the regions of Italy illustrating relationships with the old country stay in the alcoves around the walls of the pavilion as layered dioramas, evoking characteristics from each region. Where possible, special Northern Rivers Italian community relationships and celebrations will be depicted from each region. Text will be minimal and we're very much reliant on the objects and the imagery, and bilingual. Objects from the New Italy collection and other ephemera will be key to the content. The large Northern Rivers Italian community map will capture the spread, the very large spread of a very big community across the landscape, which happened between 1900 to 1970. Let's go back. You can see perhaps some red concentric circles would actually show where the soundscape will feature. Okay, Expo 88, I'm not quite sure if any of you actually managed to get to Brisbane during 1988, but Expo 88 was certainly a centre of attention there. The Italian Pavilion there had these particular displays, and you can see that they have an Italianness, I guess. The terraced archways and alcoves feature balustrades in pink, cream and gold, and they suggest, with big inverted commas, Renaissance paintings and architectural scenes from the Italian cities like Siena. An immaculate 3D interpretation from a Da Vinci drawing of a car and costume plastered figures clustering opera boxes all offer a sense of Italianness from a 1980s perspective. Okay, so we can see closer up now where the sound placements will be and how they will enhance the themes of the various displays. In its early rendition, say from the 1990s, you'll see Florian Volpato's paintings in both the alcoves and the archways. In the alcoves, he has sort of large paintings of featured landscapes from various regions, and in the archways, we have these sort of costumed ladies. Since 2013, these original displays have been removed after termite and general deterioration in the subtropics of the Northern Rivers. The resulting repairs enabled the beginnings of the pavilion upgrade expanding possibilities built on its original exhibition plan. So you can see the cleaning up process, if you like, and the reinstalling of walls and the reinstalling of paintings and the cleaned up sort of interior. That's what it looks like at the moment. It's a large space and with a high ceiling, approximately 9 metres by 30 metres with a 5 metre ceiling in parts. The building renovations will include refreshed eastern and southern entrances, the lining of the ceiling and a new polycarb skylight. Okay, the 5 metre vertical height in parts will enable the migration stories theme to dominate the centre of the building. This mock-up, and it's sort of thank you Photoshop, reflects current ideas that the redevelopment will bring to the pavilion, adding the experience of the 20th century Italian chain migration amidst global upheavals. These migration waves, so instrumental in creating the new new Italian settler story in the Northern Rivers, are strung together like beads on a necklace. They have an inclusion of sound bites from the original recordings from Leslie Jenkins' Power of the Land, which give authentic voices to these experiences and create a vivid layering effect of community experiences. So you can see down the centre of the building we have a decade by decade sort of drops of digital imagery on the semi-translucent banners. The pavilion visitor will be greeted by a wharf and cargo net holding passenger cargo, cherished belongings from their journey from Italy to Australia. Using an open suitcase display technique, visitors will experience their layered expressions of hope, anticipation, regret, fear and excitement across time as they view sea chests and suitcases emitting sound and displaying personal ephemera. As soundscapes weave amongst the open displays, amongst objects and photos, the narrative is amplified and tangible, building an immersive interpretation of the migration experience.
Okay, when we were reading the transcriptions and so forth, I had a strong sense that the sound should be in the space. So we're dealing with excerpts, and very short excerpts from the actual transcriptions. And so we've got the whole range. We've got people talking in their more recently in accents, people interpreting for their parents with the original Italian in the interview, people talking on behalf of their parents who are no longer with us. So it's going to be quite an interesting thing. And I've just put together just a couple of those bites to give you an overview of the sort of things that we're dealing with. And they're pretty rough. They're pretty much just cut out. Because they're just the highlights, I'm waiting for the text panels to be finished, and then we'll see what will work. Oops.
Well, at the time, apparently the Australian government was seeking people from that area to migrate to Australia, and they had three choices. They'd either migrate to Australia, they'd either migrate to Canada, or they could migrate to Argentina. But of the three, because of the economic climate at the time out here, they decided to migrate to Australia. They left around about 1927. Well, at the time, apparently the Australian government was seeking.
Then they're seeing the business.
Oh, sorry. And unlike earlier speakers who gave it very clearly, I think given that we've got 5 minutes left, we'll just move on. But there were quite a few, and yeah. This, when I first started doing the transcriptions, and I wish I'd been to the podcast class before I did this over the last couple of years. It's going to be so simple from now on. I put it into an Excel spreadsheet so that I had some idea of the different themes, and that's pretty much what I was doing.
Thank you. Okay, and from that wonderful Excel sheet, good on you Excel and good on you Joan, I've kind of added what I could find from the collection and identified where particular quotes and voices could be put into the actual display and how they related to objects from the collection and photographs from the collection as well. Okay, so then this is just again another mock-up of how we can go, working with these funny sort of alcoves and archways and trying to depict kind of connections to regions of Italy, the 20 regions of Italy, as well as connections that those community members from the Northern Rivers of New South Wales have to those 20 regions. And there's only a few regions where we don't have a representative from, so it's quite an interesting spread. Okay, and there's a dioramic kind of methodology, if you like, put into the actual displays. So we have Florian's beautiful paintings in the background, and then builds a sort of a layered interpretation of flavours and recipes and various things from particular regions. In the archway, which is depicted in a darker tone, it actually expands on an aspect of the Northern Rivers Italian community. In this particular case, we're using an old tabernacle from a church to talk about faith in the community. Of course, most of the Italians from the Northern Rivers of New South Wales come from Veneto and from Friuli. And so we've decided, the Northern Rivers Italian Reference Group have decided to actually start working and trying to complete Veneto. And next door to it, there's an archway with a cafe scene, references to the cafe scene in Lismore, featuring the life of Florian Volpato and also his infamous first cappuccino machine in Lismore. Okay, so that's our next project. Now, I sort of put this as the last one because I think it actually says a lot. First of all, on the left-hand side, there is a description of how to make salami. You take one pig and you deal with it in the middle of every year on the shortest day, the shortest night of the year when it's cold. And my relative has actually sort of identified how you split up that pig and roughly how much salami meat you have, how much musette meat. I mean, musette is like a cotechino. And sausages, and etc., until you get to the head and the trotters, which is a bit off. So I apologise to any vegetarians in the audience. And then he goes about how to make 62 salamis. And it's a lovely process. I've been a part of it. And these images on the right-hand side are my family. I'm not Italian myself, and people with a surname like Lane and Kelly aren't Italian, but maybe they have connections through friends and family who are Italians. So I'd like to leave it with that slide because to me that says a lot about community, family, resourcefulness, and how you actually work together to achieve a particular outcome.
Okay, I've just got permission. Yeah, that's okay, because the one that I didn't play is all about the salami. I hope it works. This is the first salami, one of the first salami shops.
Then I seen the business, like this little shed that was at that time, as small was making. A sort of cool room and a couple of sheds out the back where you dry your salami the old-fashioned way with stoves, and you had to cut up all your wood to dry your salami. We used to do it that way.
Questions?
I'm just thinking about the benefit of exhibitions like that, setting things up, to adding to oral history,
My sister is married to an Italian, like has been for the last 45 years or so, and went more into that community than coming the other way. So there was a tomato sauce making in the backyard and stuff. But she went on a tour of the Vesuvius exhibition. What am I talking about? What's the city? Pompeii, yes, Pompeii exhibition. With the Donna Calabrese group of ladies who'd mostly migrated out here in the 1950s. And my sister was just astounded at different things in the exhibition that these ladies were saying, oh, we had that, oh, we used that. It's just quite amazing, like things from hundreds of years ago that they were still using the same methods. So maybe even the salami and the tomato sauce making. Anyway, thank you. The benefits of even an exhibition that goes on. Yes.
It has a sort of relevance back to old Italy, if you like. You can actually see the links.
Yes,
Hi, that was a really interesting presentation, thank you. Looks like a really exciting place to visit. I just was interested with your very last comment about the two of you not being Italian. And having come just from the First Nations session this morning where positionality was so intrinsic to any discussion now about working with First Nations communities, and you talked about First and Second Nations or non-Indigenous people being involved in those projects, and the way the ethnicity or the background of the person can become a barrier either to being involved as a non-Indigenous person, or in the case of the First Nations person who was trying to get ethics approval was also questioned about her positionality and conflicts and so forth. I was just really interested to hear whether it ever comes up in a European sort of Anglo context when you have people that are involved who aren't of the European background of the community that's being represented.
That's interesting. Okay. I worked with this community about 15 years ago as a museum advisor in the area, and worked very closely with one member who was solely responsible for the museum at the time. And then I left, and as I left, someone else came in, also non-Italian, to help them with local development. And she said, oh, you've got this fabulous group running, how do I keep that going? So lo and behold, I come back a couple of years ago, and the group's still going because Leonie has taken on that group, and she will tell you how she works very closely with them.
Okay, how did I get involved with this? And also, I sort of feel like I've been given permissions by virtue of who I know and who I've talked to. And I was working at Southern Cross University for about 20 years, and as a lecturer in digital art and design, and I took on a few different social history projects to interpret and to design. I became interested in the telling of migration stories, and I did, because of my own growing up in the northern rivers of New South Wales, the fact that a lot of my friends were Italians, and my brother married into an Italian family, and I sort of, I felt like I was part of them, and they were part of me, sort of thing. So I guess I felt comfortable in working with people who I just got to know. You know, they were part of my circle. And I conducted interviews. A lot of my school friends who were Italo-Australians, they actually came on board and helped me do a lot of the sort of interviews and some of the research. Wrote down all of their experiences, and I've used that as sort of source material. So I feel like I've come to it from a very personal, private sort of space, but I've been given permission to work like that. At the moment, I'm working with New Italy Museum Inc.,
on the committee there, and I sort of work very closely with organising projects through there as well. So I'm a part of it, I'm sorry. No. Yeah.
Question about, does this come up in every space? And interestingly, the earlier presentation of the Cantonese speakers, where you have the narrator and the interviewer or historians speaking the same sort of language. It's just like really interesting.
It is.
But it sounds like in your own case, you've definitely built up those trusted relationships that are essential to that.
Yeah, I think so. And you know, we're in the 21st century now, and most people speak English. And so, you know, as in the case of the Cantonese, I wouldn't. If most people spoke Italian, I probably wouldn't presume to be as intimately involved as I am.
Yeah, I'd just like to comment on that too, from the Cantonese experience. These aren't first generation, and they're Australianised, and and very open to, you know, we've got skills, but we don't have the skills we need. So can you give us your skills? So my role, you know, 15 years ago was to train them and help them, you know, to help themselves. I didn't go in to do it for them. So that's not my role ever. I used to go in and do things for people, and usually it was a very short project, but, you know, their whole role was to teach them and guide them through the processes and to be independent, and so they can carry on their own work for themselves. And I've seen Leonie do it go that, you know, it's a step further. She's, yeah, it's amazing just working with her. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks for sharing how to carry on the project. My question is, as the exhibition is much more sound-based, are there any tour at it, or how do the docent facilitate the tour for the exhibition?
Yeah, it probably won't have a lot of tour element. It's quite, it's about 40 minutes from the nearest settlement. It's a precinct in the bush, just right on the highway. It's a lovely cafe. If you're ever going up there, you pass New Italy, and you thought, I must stop here one day, please do. And the volunteers struggle to get there. So, and volunteers are elderly, and it's a very open space. So it's a space you can just walk around. It's free. So there's no one at the front desk. There's no really, apart from on Monday. And just, you know, my just little anecdote about the outposts and arches. When I worked in that space, and I love always working in the space because you get to see everyone's reaction. It's amazing how many people come in and go, oh, I've been there. Can I get a photo? And I want to Insta that. Or, you know, that's more recent. That didn't happen before, but always it was people coming in saying, oh, I've been there. Or, more often than not, it's like, I was about to go there and COVID hit, so, you know, come over and let's have a look at that. And yeah, and then see where else people are going easily, because here it is. It's all there. Very exciting when you work there.
Just very quickly, how's it funded, all of this wonderful work?
A constant struggle.
Yeah.
Yeah, it is a constant struggle. I'm actually waiting on announcements on various grant applications at the moment for mainly for the renovation of the building. It does need a little bit of tender loving care. And then we've kind of costed and budgeted the actual sort of building of the displays within. And we're going through a process now with a very skilled treasurer to actually put together a plan for a series of sponsors and donated towards individual displays. We figured that's the best way to do it. The Italian community are very good at working as a community. I mean, they do help each other. So we're reliant heavily on that, and I've been sort of following the advice of my lovely reference group to see whether this would work. And so we're in that process at the moment of trying to find enough money. We've got some money, but not enough.
So has it been council funded too?
Tiny bit of council funding, not very much. We should get more. Yeah.
Afternoon tea is beckoning, so could I have one final?
Oh, sorry.
No. It's time. Carry on the conversation at our